Okay, I think we're recording. Hello, hello. Yeah, yep. So this is a pre-taped lecture for B74, the body in literature and film. The synchronous online discussion will be this Tuesday evening, March 2nd, 6:30 p.m. It's an online discussion. This class is not moving to live in class. B76, Hollywood Genres, is. A11, my other class, is not. Just trying to keep that clear for the upcoming ball of confusion. So we'll get a link for the 6:30 p.m. class. So under discussion, it's a bit more than usual, but I was sort of trying to take advantage of reading week and hoping that you might want to see some interesting movies, namely The Fly and American Psycho, the 1958 version of The Fly. I'm going to put in an extra credit question relative to the 1986 version of The Fly by remake by David Cronenberg. But we'll be talking about the original and then American Psycho with Christian Bale, directed by Mary Harron. So those are the four works. Remember that this class, all my classes, are cumulative. So things we can go all the way back to Dora, and I might in this very tape and talk about issues that have been there from the beginning. What I would suggest, in some ways, Metamorphosis, the four works on the Rocking Horse Winter. So Metamorphosis is the turn of the century. The Fly is mid-century. I guess the Rocking Horse Winter is actually a bit earlier than that. It's pre-World War II, and the Fly is post-World War II, and obviously American Psycho is 2090 something. It's slightly pre 9/11, I think. But one way to so Metamorphosis is still the same time as Dora. It's still the same time that Freud is developing psychoanalysis. Obviously, Freud, Kafka also wrote in the Penal Colony. If you're in Professor Flynn's class, the movie The Trial with Norman Bates, directed by Orson Welles, is also based on a novel by Kafka. That's just an aside. But the shift, you might think about it this way: Metamorphosis, it shows the effect on the body of an increasing bureaucracy. Arguably, we see that, but that remember we also see that in Dora. We see a little bit of that in the Sandman. Hoffman's The Sandman will be important here because the Sandman is kind of a classic early modern doppelganger, alter ego, uncanny. But right shortly after Hoffman, the doppelganger, it also started to mutate. We're going to talk about a lot about mutation today, actually. How did the master discourse, which I'll talk about, mutate into capitalist discourse? Because that's roughly what you see as you move from all the early works we've seen in this class to these increasingly postmodern late works. And we're going to do yet another revisionist look in the coming weeks through March, where we look at the racialized body in movies such as Spike Lee's Bamboozled and Nella Larsen's novel Passing. And so this is a weird class to teach because I keep going back to the beginning because there's so many layers to what the body has gone through in for want of a better word, modernity. We've seen, basically, if I go back to one of your parts of your prompt for your midterm, which is probably fresh on your mind, how does the inchoate experience of physicality become contained and stabilized as, quote, a body? By the imposition of discourse, language, primarily symbolism, image, and representation, or the framing of the image in relation to its content and in relation to what's beyond its content. So the common denominator here is, how does an inchoate body, without quotes, become a coate body, in quotes. And there are numerous strategies. One that we looked at quite a bit at the beginning is gender performance, performing as feminine, performing as masculine. Both of those, performing masculinity imposes a coherence on the inchoate male body. Performance of femininity is a strategy for imposing coherence on a female body. It's important to say all of these fail. All of these produce excess or surplus or unconscious things, or the real. All of those things are outside the reality of the gender performance. Does create a strategy and a narrative of coherence, but the price one pays, if you will, of entering that symbolic order, of letting your body go into that symbolic order, you gain a mirror image consistency, that I am the perfection of this image I see in the mirror, but at the expense of drawing a line, essentially, where the contours of your body are now looking at the news lately, are now the embattled boundaries. So right at the moment, Russia is the real of the Ukraine, trying to infiltrate, trying to cross boundaries as though they're not there, declaring that the Ukraine is not and never has been a nation, dissolving, which is, by the way, another strategy, a political strategy for coherency, is to first have what you understand as a nation in relation to historical events, and then people can align themselves with that as patriots, as Ukrainians, as Russians. And so the invasion of the country becomes literally an attack on bodies, both physically through military actions, but also hugely psychologically. What we're seeing, I think, a lot with Ukrainians, school teachers lining up to be given a Kalashnikov automatic rifle, is the seamlessness between the attempt of the Russian army to collapse nationalism, which is also seen as a psychological erasure, that people are willing to take a gun and fight and risk death because the alternative is a psychic death. It's perceived as, for not just for them, but possibly also for their children. So the stakes are high enough to die for. We didn't see this in Afghanistan, because Afghanistan never had as clear a collective national consciousness. Clearly, the Afghans have lived there for generations, and they have an awareness of themselves, which is pretty much outside Western culture, and they've subsisted in the shadow of modern warfare for 4 generations. So there was no danger of an intact, healthy Afghani national consciousness. That can no longer be crushed. It's a weird strength that can no longer be crushed by violating the Afghani borders. It's been done for too long. That now has taken on a kind of secretive, hidden identity. So there was less of a need, frankly, to die at the hands of the Taliban. And so when the Taliban said, "Put down your weapons and go home," that wasn't seen as a loss of their strategy of coherence. So that melting away of resistance, which seemed to stun the U.S., it's not happening. It's so different in the Ukraine. The Ukraine is still heavily invested in a collective consciousness, in a social imaginary, and by that I don't mean that it doesn't exist, but I mean in a shared collective strategy for organizing reality against the incursions of a hostile real, which in this case is Putin, who's very clear that he wants to invade the collective consciousness of the Ukraine, so that it will be unable to distinguish itself. But what Putin's also running up against is Ukraine's been invaded before. It's been occupied before. It's survived occupations. When somebody, I think, asks Zelensky or somebody else about what it was like when Russia had invaded Ukraine, he, in distinct contrast to Putin's history lesson, he said, Ukraine never went anywhere. The Russians occupied here, and then they didn't. And the Ukraine was the same before as it was after. So that invasion is not given the historical agency of having changed the reality of what Ukraine is or what it means to be Ukrainian. So partly we're watching a battle of history lessons, which is particularly what has, I think, alarmed Europe, is if Putin's sense is that that one has to get back to the borders that were established directly after World War II, then a world war would be hard to prevent. Okay, that's an aside, just because we're saturated with the news media right now, and I offer our very, very specific slant. Also, when you have a military engagement like the one that has taken over, all the news media, to me, it is a reminder that at the base of everything is the body. I think modernity has a tendency to dismiss the problem, the issue of the body, as solved, as the market. We'll be talking about this with the capitalist discourse. It basically says the problem of moving from a body without quotes to a body with quotes has been solved, because the market will produce, in relation to whatever demands you have for resolving the gap between your body before the symbolic and your body after the symbolic. But this is a consumerist cycle. In other words, the market claims that they will produce according to your demand, but your demands, by definition, the difference between demand and desire. Demand is what is what wanting to be the full totality of the real within your reality, impossible, and desire is the attempt to make that, to cross that bridge, which is also impossible, but that creates social bonds, that creates community, that can also create discontent and even violence, but social bonds in the fullest sense of the word, negative and positive. Capitalist discourse is kind of scary, because the market says it will produce whatever your demand requires, and then it produces a commodity which it positions as the equivalent of your demand, which it never is, never can be. It's only advertising that even makes it appear to be in that position. So you have to consume, and the act of consumption is designed to appear to be the resolving of the split subjectivity that we can see in the Sandman, for instance, that this uncanny effect of being terrified that his hostility toward the father, for instance, sets up a chronic fear of castration. The attitude of the male body toward the female body is to see the female body as a cautionary tale that somehow endured a castration. And then the man can operate as the uncastrated in relation to the woman. But when you act uncastrated in the symbolic realm, it's just that, it's an act. Entering the symbolic realm is a form of psychic castration that has nothing to do with the anatomy, except that it's predicated. So this protuberance, if you will, of male anatomy is seen as evidence of the possibility of being the master signifier, being the master, which immediately sets up the terror of, what if I lose this protuberance? And not literally this protuberance, but what if I lose my ability to stabilize my position in the place of the master? And that's where masculinity can become toxic, when the perceived threat to the position of mastery reaches a certain level where violence of different kinds, verbal or actual, seem warranted. Putin is acting doing the toxic masculine thing rather well right now, as a insisting that everybody's threatening him. I mean, he's literally invading a country by land, by sea, by air, with 190,000. And he is saying that Russia is under attack. It's psychotic, except that I suspect he knows full well that he's trying to employ he's trying to occupy a certain position, essentially as a victim, which is kind of remarkable. But a lot of threatened men in the position of the master signifier, curiously, they will ramp up their violence at the same time that they ramp up their claim of being a victim. And we saw this with Trump over and over again. It's so unfair. The election was stolen. I was treated very, very badly. He goes on about this, even as he was calling and twisting arms and threatening all kinds of actions against if people didn't, quote, find the votes. So he was an unleashed tyrant saying, I'm being treated so unfairly. And it's kind of it's a gaslighting, it's mind bending, it's reality bending. But that's what propaganda is, versus some attempt to narrate the facts. Propaganda is persuading you to act against your own best interest. Lay down your arms. Don't support Ukrainians. Don't support your government. Your government's fascist. Actually, their president is Jewish. I mean, this you can't push this very far before it's absurd. But logic, and this is something that comes up in this class, not all my classes, logic is way overrated. We think the world is run by logic. Logic is a fairly flimsy attempt to organize our fantasies into a semblance of reality, and those fantasies they're like tectonic plates in an earthquake zone. They're shifting constantly, and we furiously arrange and rearrange our discourse, our narrative of self to stabilize the shifting that we can't stop. And since it didn't happen, or it was somewhere else, or it was something else, and the place where you can most see the desperate attempts to either control the shifting of the tectonic plates, which nobody can do, is at the point of the master signifier who is feeling threatened. And I mean, I think then the latest Putin has activated the deterrence force in Russia. He's in full invasion mode, and he's activating, separate from that, a force that is designed to repel attacks against Russia, because, as he put it, and I think this is almost a quote, the leaders of major NATO countries have allowed themselves to make aggressive remarks. It's like, you're awfully touchy for someone who's leading an active invasion, but that also makes sense. You see it with colonialism. We'll see it a lot with the racialized body. When you strategize violence against other bodies, you become extremely worried about if you can do this to them, if you can do this to these bodies, then that could, theoretically at least, this could be done to your body. Because no matter how much you insisted, Black people are different, or whatever the racist trope is, their bodies, clearly, they bleed, they're hurt. So are you. So no matter how much you buy into your racist trope of intrinsic superiority, like white supremacy, your body's not superior. It bleeds, it cuts, it breaks. There's no way to deny that. So, I mean, it is denied, but there's no way to stably deny that. So people who, and this is true of, say, in a domestic abuse situation, the abuser becomes paranoid about being abused, and even becomes convinced, why did you make me hit you? Why are you treating me this way? Why are you so unfair to me? You make me hate you. I don't feel good about that. Why are you abusing me? And this becomes a full cycle. And part of that is this sense that there's no such thing as a stabilized body sense. The body is inchoate. That's how you stabilize it. You can talk about that. And that's, in some ways, that's what Discourse is about. Are there ways to stabilize the body that are more or less, I use this word cautiously, better? And I think, yeah, there are. There clearly are. I mean, anorexia is a way to try and impose a pattern on an inchoate body. This is a body that that only had 50 calories today. This is I am in control of this body because I am, losing weight or not gaining weight. OCD, elaborate rituals that stabilize the body or seem to. Going to the mall shop stabilizes the body, or seems to. Invading another country stabilizes the body, or seems to. So that's kind of what this course is about. So I can imagine the question states like, so Professor Leonard, how do you want to stabilize the body, or how do you stabilize your body? Well, if this is the best way to put it, I stabilize my body by recognizing the impossibility of doing so, and then living in the problem rather than embracing false solutions, which is another way to define the fetish. The fetish is nominating something as proof that a solution you have employed to stabilize your body has succeeded in a way that's permanent. And then the fetish becomes proof of your now forever stabilized body. But really all you've done is shift your anxieties to preserving your possession or pursuit of the fetish. And commodities are fetishes in that way. And because they can't, and they don't stabilize the coherence of the body, the best fetishes are the ones that always seem to be transforming and mutating out of your reach. We can see that in the Sandman, just sort of pursuing some idea that he doesn't seem to be able to get from his fiancée, but then miraculously he gets it from Olympia. Olympia is a fetish object. She's a proto-commodity. She's designed by the market to appear to be the equivalent of what his demand requires to resolve the unresolvable schism at the basis of his subjectivity. And the thing is, other people can look at your fetish and think it's ridiculous. One person's fetish is as another person's absurdity. And this obviously we tend to think of fetishes in the sexual realm where they're obviously very active, but that's just the most obvious. But even other people's quote unquote sexual fetishes can seem absurd. Like how is that an exciting scenario to you? It would be could be a very common response. Like even if you don't judge somebody else's scenario, you don't get it. It's like, well, it's not a turn on for me. You might say to each his own. And that's fine too, unless the fetishes start to employ a higher and higher degree of violence or humiliation or abuse. Because one way to try and conquer the fetish so that it will become the proof of your coherence, which it can never do, you can idealize the fetish the way that Nathaniel does with Olympia. But you can also abuse and humiliate the fetish, try and break it down, as domestic abuse might do, or as Jimmy Stewart does in Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo, or as we will see consistently, Bateman, American Psycho, Norman Bateman. The director Mary Harron there's a lot of clever allusions to the earlier American Psycho, Hitchcock's 1960 Psycho. But Bateman's attitude toward women as consumable objects, literally, so he actually starts biting and admits later in his taped confession to his lawyer, I ate some of their brains, and we have a hint of the zombie concept, but that need to consume the fetish, because if you could eat the fetish, then your body would appropriate it. So this is just the far end of a perverse attempt to absorb the fetish. No, but notice increasingly this is done through capitalism. Capitalism makes profit by producing objects, which then get advertised as commodities, which then function as fetishes, which means they have a surplus value now. They claim to do something beyond what they can do. Obviously, a deodorant, it's any good, could give you a certain scent for a certain amount of time. That would be the exchange value. $5 for something that helps me not have a nervous odor. But then why do we call them secret and brute and preferred stock and boss and all these other names? And why do we situate them? If it's for men, it's on a granite rock with an ocean smashing into the rock, and if it's for women, it's in some wifty meadow somewhere with butterflies floating by. What's the point of that framing? What's the point of that very, very different discourse? It's the same product. That's the effect. That's where advertising generates, and why advertising is actually more important than production now. We're in a very postmodern era where what products move according to advertising, not according to what they are, but according to how well they can be placed in a discourse of being a fetish that you can own, control, appropriate, attach to the delusion of your coate body image, make the mirror image the equivalent of you. That's the commodities constantly negotiating that, constantly promising to close the gap so that you can be the perfection of the mirror image. So when we look at metamorphosis, another way to think about this, and I got some notes off to the side here if I glance there, because some of this stuff's a little complicated, and we'll talk more about it on Tuesday night. But with Gregor Samsa awoke one morning to discover that he was a giant beetle, dung beetle, vermin. There's a lot of different ways to translate, but cockroach had become. It's probably not technically. It's probably a dung beetle if you really want to get into the insect. But cockroach makes sense, I think, in terms of our English translation, and the description is similar enough. But here we see Kafka finds a way to present an allegory of what it feels like to have your body completely given over to a bureaucratic system as opposed to a theologic. What's the dark comedy of Metamorphosis? And there are several accounts of Kafka laughing a lot as he read this story to his friends. A dark humor for sure, but I don't think we want to set aside that there is a macabre humor in Poe too, with the Telltale Heart. Very macabre, and you might not be stopping your knee laughing, but saying, if you still think I'm mad, let me explain how carefully I dismembered the body, and the tub caught all the blood. On the darkest level, there's something funny about that, to the degree that humor is about a dislocation between the conscious and the unconscious. Most humor is somehow activating the chronic disjunction between the stated and the unstated. The undergraduate seminar that you guys are having itself, I think, is sponsoring. The theme is humor. I think they've asked me to come and give a talk there. I guess it's live about humor, and so I will. But more importantly, you guys might want to submit something to Professor Rigi. Yulia Rigi, I believe, is heading it up. Maybe I can put a notice on it. But something about humor. Very broadly conceived. So if you don't have something in your back pocket about humor, probably something you have done in this class or other classes could have some relationship. So the running joke, if I can say it that way, of Metamorphosis is that Gregor has been so bureaucratized. And what I think Kafka does so brilliantly is by giving Gregor a completely different body, because the effects of the bureaucracy on the body have been so naturalized. He gets up at dawn. He's a salesman of some sort. He works these incredibly long hours. He has to run for trains. He never satisfies his boss. He never seems to quite reach his quota. No matter how much he makes, the family still acts like they're barely subsisting. He has been so trapped, and turning into a bug is Kafka's way of literalizing a symptom, because the symptom is a kind of the revenge of the repressed. It's the revenge of the unconscious. When this tension between the reality you attempt to uphold and the pressure and the weight of the real that structured reality is trying to keep out, when it reaches as it begins to reach an unbearable point, symptoms will filter through, which is really the real filtering through, but only able to come through the lens of the reality that we insist on sustaining. So the symptoms don't make sense. The point is, they don't make sense because they're like spies in a way, not unlike dreams. They have to contort themselves so that, because they're not part of your reality. They're coming from outside your reality, but they are filtered through what you use to filter everything. In some ways, our reality is like it's kind of like a kidney in the sense that, speaking of bodies, we filter out everything except what we need. So so the purpose of the kidney, roughly, is the flow of our bodies includes waste product. And this happens with the liver, and so much of the body is about taking in a product that can only be partly used. So our lungs they need to draw in air, but from that air, the oxygen has to be taken out, and then the CO2, carbon dioxide, that the body has already generated through its functioning has to be put into the exhale. So you, as you guys know, you inhale oxygen, you exhale something like carbon dioxide, and the carbon dioxide is toxic. So you can drown or suffocate within 4 minutes. That's, we kind of forget that our body is in the flow of air, water, food, heat, cold, touch, and we are completely open. Things are flowing through us. We're like a reed in the stream or something, and I think this has gotten aggravated by modernity that acts like the body is self-sufficient and self-enclosed. That's another bad effect of leaning heavily on strategies that seem to prop up the delusion of a permanent coherence. Colonialism, the need for more land, for more money, for more power, the need for more is really an attempt to keep alive it's sort of impossible to maintain delusion that your strategy of coherence is now permanent. It never is. It never can be. It can be effective under certain conditions for a certain time. And yet the drive is always to concretize it, naturalize it, right? Come up with take a symbolic strategy using language and make it the equivalent of a biological organism, which it can never be, no matter how much we police that dialogue. So okay, how did I get so off on kidneys? I think it's relevant. Gregor is upset because how is he going to get dressed? I mean, that's the shock of the story in a way. It's shocking enough he wakes up and he's a bug. What's amazing is he immediately turns, it's like you and I might wake up with a headache or scratchy throat and say, oh, shoot. Or I might say, I'm supposed to go teach a class. I'm supposed to lecture for 2 hours. My throat's sore. I'm tired. And do I cancel the class? Oh God, I don't know. Am I that sick? What is, that is, it's one thing to react that way if you wake up with a scratchy throat. What Kafka suggests, and rather brilliantly, is we're so committed to seeing the bureaucratic demands as superior to the organic demands, that it would probably, that even if we woke up as a giant bug, we would have the same dialogue with ourselves or something similar than if we had a scratchy throat. So in his case, how do I get dressed? How do I can't work the doorknob anymore? Doorknobs in a sense are fetish objects in a very primitive sense, because they're designed to make it convenient to reach out with your hand. But we also know that you have to have a hand. They're very human. I mean, and most pets don't know how to work doorknobs. No, I'm sure your adorable dog or cat may, but in general, they don't. And so doors can keep out anything. And so now, everything about, suddenly Gregor is able to generate how uncanny his room is. It isn't, his room's not any more uncanny than it was before. It's his body's changed. And so that suddenly, and we see something like that in the Sandman, when he sees that Olympia's a robot, when he watches through the telescope and sees her torn apart and sees her eyes out, he flails, falls apart, eventually jumps to his death. So the room's made uncanny in an instant. Like, sheets don't make sense. They just fall off of the shellacked body of the insect, and he can't speak. I mean, he still can. There's nothing wrong with his capacity to speak, except that his jaws aren't the right kind. So he's speaking, or feels that he's speaking. Like, he is trying to say, hello, I'm Gregor, and what comes out is this insect screech. And so they presume that he can't, that he's not talking, and eventually that he's not Gregor, but he always is inside this apparatus. He remains Gregor, and that becomes such a powerful allegory of modernism and really of modernity in this case, that we remain. And you see this with Sylvia Plath. There are two of me now, and beware, there's a price for the eyeing of my scars, and out of the ashes I rise and eat men like air. There is that revenge fantasy on Plath's part, which is so consistent, is that there is still a living, breathing, frightened entity that is increasingly being shoved into a corner. There's a moment in Plastic where she worries about, this double wants her to die, wants to paint over her face, not toward cosmetics, until but there's a paradox there, because it's the double will also die if it succeeds in killing its host in that sense, which it does in the poem Edge, very late in Plath's career, where she says the woman has perfected her dead body, wears a smile of accomplishment. That's the paradox of pursuing all the fetishized commodities that promise to stabilize your body, mostly by covering it up, reshaping it. Your body is what you're given, as the 1950s Girdles ad put it. Your figure is what you make of it. Anorexia is an attempt to shape a body into a figure. So going to the gym, and we see that opening scene in American Psycho, we can see how psychotic the leaning on commodities to fashion the body. If we look at that scene, and maybe we can on Tuesday night, where you get that voiceover, where he talks about all of his face regimens, and that he puts on the ice pack for his eyes if they're flabby. And it's very methodical, it's very organized, it's very calm. There is no, there's zero anxiety. I mean, that's until the addiction to the commodities and to seeing women as commodities, and to trying to suddenly eat the women to absorb their their status as purchasable commodities, because he's kind of fascinated between hiring prostitutes and then having the friend over who's unaware of the scenario that he's designed. Because just buying the prostitute doesn't, it makes it, when you buy a commodity, it's harder to mistake the commodity as proof of your coherence. So buying a woman for the night it's the easiest thing, it would seem, and they work and they labor for you as the master, and then they take the money and they leave. But there's still a problem because you're aware that this is a financial exchange. So Bateman tries to blur that line by having a woman over who's not a prostitute, certainly treats her like one, but through drugging her, interestingly, she's the one that he tries to appropriate, not the prostitute. I mean, later he drops the chainsaw, which is from the balcony, and this is a complicated homage to Vertigo and to Psycho and to other many slasher movies that Psycho spawned of, why are women being chased? The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a subtext of American Psycho, but this slaughtering, this pursuit of the woman to dismember, and when dismember those Hans Belmer dolls that we looked at earlier, is really a projection of a perceived sense that oneself is coming apart. So let me just do a couple technical things if I can, because I do them on tape, and then we can maybe talk more about this on Tuesday night. So we're partly, Lacan talks a lot about different discourses, and his primary one traditionally has been the master discourse, which would be this. And the master discourse, as you can see, what happens here is that you have someone who occupies the position of the master. Now, in order to occupy the position of the master, you have to place yourself in proximity to a master signifier. So, and it's easy to make the point in religion. Say the Pope is able to align himself as with God. God is the ultimate master signifier. The difference between a master signifier and all other signifiers is that the master signifier is presented as having no antecedent. Nothing precedes the master signifier, and therefore all signifiers are now able to generate meaning relative to their relationship to the one signifier that has no relative relationship to anything other than itself. So I am the alpha and the omega. I have no beginning and I have no end. I alone know all the problems. This is the discourse of the master signifier, and Godot would come to mind for those in my other class, but that's more of a nostalgia because the master discourse is falling apart in the 50s, and in moving forward, the master discourse had been science, and when we move from bureaucracy to technocracy, when we move from Metamorphosis to The Fly, there's no clear reason why why the scientist he's anxious to splice together genes to figure out a way to transport more quickly. But this is a capitalist concept. This is not really a scientific concept. He is attempting to accelerate the capacity to transfer products, and he's a little like Lucky, and that's from Godot, where he's so given over to creating this something that'll be useful for the market that he just slides right past the dangers, like the transporting the cat didn't work out too well, and he continues to subject himself. We saw this. We see the beginnings of this in Frankenstein. Like what is the larger point of sewing together body parts to generate life? There's a market value. So the need to set up a market that can presumably generate the equivalent of our demands. It's an endless process. And we've seen that science, Lucky's an example of this, but that science has increasingly become the slave of the market. So the pressure on scientists to skip pure science, if you will, to get to market. Research and development is the primary employer of all scientists now, and certainly at university as well. one of the biggest donators to the pharmacy department at U of T is Shoppers Drug Mart. And I'm not trying to do a conspiracy theory here. It's just a fact. And they help build classrooms. And it's understood, or supposedly understood. Maybe a lot of people adhere to this, that Shoppers Drug Mart won't interfere with the knowledge formation, that the research that their donations allow in various labs and in various classrooms. But it's probably naive to presume that there will never be a later demand placed on the research to shore up something that's more marketable versus less marketable. And pharmaceuticals are kind of probably the most. Pharmaceuticals too have a fetish dimension. I mean, they have a biochemical influence on the body. But if you listen to most pharmaceutical ads, the latter half of the ad, even though they start talking really, really fast, is all of the many, many, many negative side effects that could possibly be there. And they conclude by saying, don't take this pill until you talk to your doctor. And what the ad presents but doesn't discuss is what are the pros and cons of it? What is it of the merits and demerits of taking the drug? The less annoying the thing that the drug solves, the more one has to wonder about the long list of possible negative effects. So, after dinner indigestion, for instance, and then a pill that solves that. And this is classic of capitalist discourse. The market produces, the market creates something that is a solution to your demand. I wish I could have pizza and fried food and cake and beer and not have a stomach ache. The real solution to that is you can't. So, but you can have a pill that affects your biochemistry and tries to offset the very reasonable reaction of your body, which is what the hell are you doing? And so there's no consequence. And biochemistry can do things like that. Biochemistry can, but it's kind of like taking the battery out of your smoke alarm. So many pharmaceuticals they're just taking batteries out of smoke alarm. They alleviate a symptom that's in fact a warning, and potentially, I mean, who wants to take a pill that'll let you put your hand on a hot stove? Because I want to put my hand on a hot stove and not have it hurt. Well, why would you do that? But an awful lot of pharmaceuticals almost seem to set themselves up that way. And I don't want to be unfair to pharmaceuticals. They also, big pharma can do a lot of really important things, chemotherapy, other things, save lives. But it's, as you get down to the consumer, like listen to CNN, at least on the radio. I think it's a lot worse when I listen to CNN on the car radio. Everything is either a relief for debt or physical pain. Honestly, I don't think I've heard another ad that's different than that. Or it's this Kafka-esque bureaucracy that we will take care of the price of doing business. Anyway, so once you have this master discourse, which is perceived as kind of the agent, because it's the first mover, it's the thing that doesn't move that causes things to move. It is the cause. It is the first cause, the first mover, and that's what gives it its status as relative. So it's as an agent, it can now make a demand of another person, another subject. And the first thing to notice is there's no reciprocity here. This is not the discourse. It makes it clear that nothing is a dialogue. And dialogues always have excess, and they always have scarcity. So when the agent that presents itself as a first mover addresses a subject, when a boss addresses a clerk, when a master addresses a slave, there is no direct return. There's already a differential. There's a discrepancy here. Now, and according to Lacan, this is the basis of the social bond, better for better or for worse. Without discourse, there is no social bond. Without a discrepancy between the demand that's placed on you by the first cause and the effect of that demand upon you, there's no possibility of a social bond. So even though this is somewhat negative, because the demand from the agent to the subject requires the subject to not answer the master, but to produce a product, the objet, as Lacan calls it, that can be returned to the master. Because the demand of the master is give me something that shores up my illusion of mastery. So that free labor, money, sex, whatever it could be. And you can see Bateman, all the men in American Psycho, it centers around restaurants in an almost psychotic way. Like no restaurant seems exclusive enough, no dish seems absurd enough. Bizarre flavored ice creams and duck and comfit, and they go on with their specials. And no restaurant's any good if you can get a reservation. I mean, that's Dorsia's becomes this running joke in American Psycho. No one wants to go to a restaurant where they can get a reservation. Because if they can get a reservation, it's not exclusive enough. And if they can't get a reservation, they experience angst. And this is also brilliantly presented with the business cards, the tenuous relationship between Bateman's sense of physical coherence and mental coherence and the integrity of his business card. And there's no master signifier there in that scene in the boardroom where they're all slapping down their business cards. The final card is presented as the master of the other cards, but there's clearly nothing beyond these cards, and all these men look the same. They can't even seem to keep one another apart. Their jobs seem the same. It's not clear what anybody does. There's no product that's manufactured by the men of American Psycho. They're financial managers. They move money around, possibly. We never see them working. We see them at work, and then we see them going to the bars and the restaurants after work. And what they do while they're at work is not completely non-productive, and even the money they're moving around is not theirs. Presumably, they get a salary from doing that, or maybe stock options. So, so this product is sent back to the master as to satisfy his demand that something be given to him that will, and of course the her can be here too. My son, my 15-year-old son now is talking about girl boss all the time, whatever. I'm trying to figure this out because it's an interesting elision of gender performance. But to girl boss, to girl bossify, maybe you guys can help me with that on Tuesday night. I keep trying to use the word, and he tells me to be quiet and never use the word again. It's amazing how touchy 15-year-olds are about their slang. I'm just curious. And he's like, oh my God, do not speak. But anyway, but it's like, I have to. This is my job. Yeah, okay. So that we see the hysteria of American Psycho. It can be traceable back to Metamorphosis. It's just that Gregor is, of course, he's the so-called proletariat. He's the worker. He's the one whose labor is extracted. He's given $5 and $10 of labor is extracted. So the proletariat is the body from which excess labor is extracted and converted into capital, which then goes to the master or the bourgeois, to use Marx's term. But as we move from, and I'm going to talk about this. Oh, let me finish my thought here, though. Is that this object that's returned? So the master's like, give me something that shores up my illusion of coherency. Okay, here I just produce this with $10 worth of labor, and the master's like, fine, here's $5. Send me the $5 profit, and it's an endless, no amount of profit, no amount of surplus will stabilize the illusion of mastery. So the demand for profit is endless. And one of the other reasons it's endless is pushing up at the bottom here is the master denies at the outset their split subjectivity. And that's how they're able to pose as having no cause. But they do have a cause, so the price of denying it is kind of smuggled into the nature of the demand, and that's what tends to create it as insatiable. So if you think of ads, an example of master discourse would be an ad that says, buy this, you need this, buy it now. So kind of an imperative. But as you move to capitalist discourse, one of as Lacan says, we're now all proletarians. There's in a sense, there's no bourgeois anymore, because there's no way to pose as the first mover that's not moved. Even super rich people, and we see this with American Psycho, are being pushed into a frenzy of consumption that that can go to the point of invading countries or trying to eat a sexual object. A woman converted first to a fetish, well, first to a sexual object, an objectified sexual being, and then to a fetish that supposedly shores up the stability of a toxic masculinity, and then to an attempt to literally eat or appropriate the fetish, now no longer even really seen as a person, much less a woman. And that's the psychosis we see in American Psycho. The Rocking Horse Winner is a much more poignant story, because it's about a boy. He's not a toxic man. He is a boy who has put his mother in the position of master signifier and has designed his life around the idea that if she's satisfied, then the tension between his mother and his father will be reduced, the house will be better. But he literally can hear the house saying, money, 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 there must be more money. And this is, unfortunately, he's a boy, so he can't figure out that it's not the house, that's his mother. There's a kind of proto-Norman Bates Psycho element to this, perhaps. But the mother is dissatisfied with her marriage. She's dissatisfied with herself. She's dissatisfied with her sense of being a mother. Nothing satisfies her. That's actually the basis of her identity, is dissatisfaction. And if I could talk to Paul, the boy in the Rocking Horse Winner, that's the point I would try to make, is understand that your mother's identity is actually predicated on discontent. You think that in fact she has this other identity that she's striving toward that requires satisfaction, but it doesn't exist. It's not there. She is discontent, and she herself has convinced herself that she has this other entity, which is on the other side of contentment, but there's nothing on the other side of her discontent. And that's the problem with not interrogating your own discontent, is that you can become it. You can become nothing else, because you increasingly double down on the fantasy that there is a version of you that is on the other side of contentment. There isn't. The version of you is always in you. So if you predicate your self-construction on a satiation that cannot incur, so that you can dream of a self that can never exist, you'll still have a self, but that self will actually, and might even protect discontent as the kernel, in the same way that when an oyster has a grain of sand, it secretes a viscous fluid to protect itself from the irritation of the sand, which eventually, in some cases, becomes a pearl. So, which takes on a very different value when it's harvested and made into jewelry. But pearl earrings are just the globes that were produced from the suffering of an oyster. It's not all that romantic, I guess, but so Paul's, and the fact that Paul does this with the market, he becomes, in a sense, a gambler. He becomes a capitalist. He needs to generate surplus for his mother at the expense of his own body. And that's the genius of Lawrence, is it and it kind of reminds me of cryptocurrency. Dryasov don't understand any better than girl boss exactly. Although, I mean, I do understand cryptocurrency. It's the latest hallucination that money already, it's a place that money already occupies. I mean, the point of money is to keep track of the degree of the excess of surplus labor that has been extracted from the worker. Because without money, there's no way to convert the labor that's stolen from the worker into uh, into something that can be translated on the market. So that's where money becomes capital, and then lately capitals become cryptocurrency, which is not so different than money, except there isn't as great a consensus in its market, so that it literally gets generated by talk, and there's nothing stabilizing it, so it can shoot up and it can shoot down. I think what Paul is doing seems more like cryptocurrency. He's seems to be generating based on some vibration that's not strictly speaking a part of the market. And of course, initially he arranges with his uncle to have the money given to his mother in installments, which drives her nuts. And the house starts screaming because as soon as she sees that she can get this gift of, I don't know, I forget, £5,000 a year based on something that's much, and now she can count on that. But there's a principle. She goes crazy. She wants the principle. So Paul says, well, fine, give her all of it. And in a way, this is an allegory of capitalism. The mother becomes the master signifier, extracting labor from the body of her son. She doesn't, realize that in the same way that Gregor's turned into an insect by the demands of his family and the bureaucracy. I guess this tape's getting a little long, so I better shift to. I hope I did. I hope I didn't hold up the. This is the MasterCard. So everything that I'd been talking about was this card. Oh God. So you have the master demanding that the subject return. So maybe I did that right. And it denies the truth. It's a split subject. Okay. So when you go to the capitalist discourse, notice that part of what's happened is that now the master signifier is the split subject. So the split subject is no longer even talks to. We're all split subjects now. Everyone is a proletariat. Everyone is waiting. Like there's no demand. There's no social bond anymore on this top line. And we see that in American Psycho. What the hell is going on with their relationships? Nobody seems to sleep with the woman they're engaged to. I think in one case, you've got a guy who's engaged to a woman who's having an affair with Bateman's fiance, and Bateman's having an affair with somebody else's fiance. And it seems important that you set up this fake social bond. And it doesn't bother Bateman that his fiance is probably having an affair. It's assumed that, the only social bond in American Psycho is exploitation. No one knows how to relate to anyone unless there's a feeling that you're getting something out of it. And there's a complete lack of recognition of anyone who's not in that circuit. So the killing of the homeless man and even his dog is this attempt now to, in a sense, to murder anything that evokes fears of the real. So Bateman, eliminates the homeless man because the fact of the homeless man is a threat to his perceived reality, and this of course gets more and more intense as the movie goes on. A lot of the women are either drunk or taking heavy tranquilizing, because their role as an object of exchange, being moved around the circuit of desire, it can only be tolerated by being essentially on the verge of unconsciousness. In the case of when he takes the fiance, when Bateman takes the fiance of one of his workers to a restaurant, claims it's Dorcia, and she doesn't seem interested in going out with him at all until he mentions Dorcia, and through some vague haze of things, she realizes, well, I haven't been there yet, and that's the latest fetish. That's the latest object. That the reason I'm a mess is I haven't been to Dorcia, or Dorothy, I guess is how they say it. And so she looks around in a haze and says, "Is this Dorcia?" And he's like, "Yes, dear." And then later the colleague says, "Thanks for taking her to Dorcia. How'd you get her reservation?" And that may be one of the reasons he did it, because he essentially murders Paul Allen, because Paul Allen has a better business card and seemed to get a reservation at Dorcia. I don't know, who cares? The name's just made up. But the restaurants themselves become, as I said, fetish objects. And even when he says to Paul Allen, nobody goes to Dorcia anymore, I don't know if that's true yet, but it will be. As soon as it's no longer seen as an impossible object, it will lose its ability to function as a fetish, and it will become just another restaurant. And in which case, and at that point, the actual quality of its food may come into, particularly with the prices, the $500 dinner, and they all throw their credit cards down on the platter. If any of you are watching Becoming Anna, strange. I don't know if it's Netflix. I've seen watching bits of it with my as I move through the living room. But excess, obviously the con artist. And by the way, Donald Trump comes up a couple times in American Psycho. I don't know if that registered with you. Is that Donald Trump's limo we hear at one point, and is that Ivanka Trump is mentioned at another point by Bayman. So, and then Ronald Reagan at the close of American Psycho, lying about Iran-Contra, which was a kind of use of funds to supply money to another kind of mini Putin who was trying to take over in Nicaragua, and then Reagan's classic master signifier comment that you can't run foreign policy by committee. Actually, that's the way you're supposed to run foreign policy. It's called democracy, and clearly Reagan's is heralding Trump. But it's eerie that the movie is. I don't think the movie could have possibly known that Trump was going to be president. I don't think anybody really thought that very seriously. But Trump is even more untethered in the movie than Reagan. But the movie does make the point that Reagan's paving the way for someone like Trump, where documents don't mean anything except what he says they mean. But then, so in the capitalist discourse, there is no social bond, and there's no social bond in American Psycho, and there's a decay of social bond in The Fly and in Metamorphosis, The Fly, and Rocking Horse, like the decay of the marriage. I think The Fly, the 1958 version of The Fly, is also an allegory of a failing marriage. The husband is a workaholic. Not all workaholics turn into flies, but he's in the lab more and more. Everything begins to only matter to him if it's related to what he's doing in the lab. Then of course, he takes on these characteristics of the fly. And by the end of the movie, where he's saying, help me, and tiny little guy, and the detective finally agrees that he could be crushed with a rock. Well, that's again an elimination of something from the real that is penetrating reality. So the end of The Fly appears to resolve the problem of workaholism, which Kafka won't allow to go away, although Gregor's also dead at the end, dried up in the corner, and gets swept out while they discuss who his sister, and now that she's blossoming, so as they put it, what kind of husband that they need to pair her with. And Gregor's, there's a lot of it, stories where some dried out man is just swept out at the end of the story. The Hunger Artist, certainly another story we could spend time with, but I can't just do the whole thing on Kafka. Okay. So my point is that the proletarian, the split subject, makes this request that the market system, so the CEOs, the executives, create create a bond that will generate the equivalent of the fetish that's required. So the split subject just waits for the market, and there's nothing. And at this point, the split subject just denies their split subjectivity with the aid of the fetish of the product that's demanded. So if an ad in the master discourse says buy it, an ad in the capitalist discourse says you are worth it. As the famous L'Oreal cosmetics slogan, we cost a little more, but you're worth it, or we do it all for you. That's a little different. That's different than the master discourse. Any ad that uses you, it becomes part of the capitalist discourse, urging you to. I thought I had a version of a difference between the capitalist ad. This may work its way into the next prompt. So the complete plugin of the female body as simply a source to generate surplus. If you look at an ad like this is for find a sugar daddy. This is new. How new phenomenon. The sugar daddy phenomenon seems to be somewhere in between prostitution and relationship, in the sense that it opens up the negotiation. So instead of saying $100 for the night, you wind up being on salary. There's it's called seeking arrangement. So you don't get paid per sexual exchange. And it also opens up like whether or not it will include a sexual exchange. It diversifies the market of prostitution considerably. So certain amount, if someone wants, someone like a Bateman wanted an attractive model to appear to be someone who wants to go to the company dinner, you could leave it at that. Does the arrangement involve a retainer or sort of pay per encounter? And also it even opens up, what is the tender that's exchanged? Is it a trip to Europe, which is not a direct payment, but what would be part of the arrangement? But what becomes even more remarkable in this particular ad is, as a working woman, you're about to lose your health care, but if you have a healthy body, you can also seek someone to so that you can afford healthcare. It's a kind of Mobius strip, and then Obamacare somehow gets thrown in there as something that's going to extract your surplus wealth that you won't be able to afford. But the reason I see this is much more of a capitalist discourse. This is not saying buy this. This is, and it's even kind of going beyond saying, you're worth it. But what it was saying is your body has an unmined potential on the marketplace. So looking at this again, so you have a sense of it saying you are worth it. And if the master discourse is arguing, trying to answer the question, what do I want? The capitalist discourse is essentially saying, what should I want? So the reason this matters a lot, that this isn't here anymore, is that it turns desire into something equivalent to what the market can produce to satisfy it. Capitalism purports to solve the problem of the split subject, basically, by saying that we will manufacture something that fits their lack, that fits that thing that is at the base of your chronic searching for coherence. In the world of plastics, that it makes sense. You can manufacture a piece that fits virtually any conceivable shape. So that, and if you ever buy things like at IKEA or elsewhere, or Legos, our case in point, when I played with Legos, they tended to just come in a box and then with pieces, and they were essentially just building blocks, and then you decided, you snapped them together any way you wanted. Then all of a sudden now we have the Legos for the Death Star, which is 5,000 pieces, and they have these strange pieces that that is very specific to the Death Star, and there's only one way to make the Death Star, and it takes 177, and I know this for a fact, steps, and if you screw up at any one of those steps. So by the end of helping my nephew make the Death Star, I felt like Gregor Samsa. I felt like I'd been turned into a giant dung beetle, and I was trying to develop strategies for explaining why pieces were no longer had a place on the Death Star, and they no longer had a place because I had stepped outside the hegemonic discourse of the Lego directions, and those pieces were now in my pocket. I took them off the board; they were excess, and the only way I was able to maintain my own presumed coherence. So my nephew had a Death Star that was, missing a few pieces, but so did the one in the movie, right? How else did Luke blow it up? Everything's missing a piece, and that becomes both why there's potentially can destroy planets, but also why they can be destroyed by a single photon or whatever they were being called. So another way to think about this is if you think of Google and the algorithm as a master signifier, then at the first part of Google, where Google scans and collects, it's what we would probably call the university discourse, where the ability to determine what is knowledge and what isn't, like what winds up in when you do a search. If you put in Kafka Metamorphosis, the line of clickable items you get is essentially, this is how the university discourse works. It becomes the master of knowledge production. So now you have a list of all of these articles that presumably have something to do with metamorphosis, and then the second part of it is where you then insist that this list meet your demand. That's called the discourse of the hysteric. And the hysteric is a good discourse. It's the discourse of a professor in some way, or at least this professor, that where your demand is to question, and your insistence is on the mechanism of what constitutes the problem, and not on the production of what constitutes the solution. That's what and so in a sense, my lecture style is hysteric. It constantly challenges the presumed. I'm only interested in things that claim that there's no need to discuss them. That's often what I want to talk about, like the body. So I'm a proud hysteric in that sense. Dora is an hysteric. And that term has a lot of negativity in our culture, because the hysteric is somebody who cannot, well, an hysteric who's seen as pathological, like Dora, who's having a breakdown. The only reason she's having a breakdown is because of what she's being asked to do within the family mechanisms. And so first she challenges her father, and then she challenges Freud. And that's what a hysteric does, is it demands answers from the master that the master can't provide, because the whole status of the master requires a shoring up of the hegemonic discourse. So Freud needs Dora to be more, quote, feminine. He needs her to admit that she was secretly or not so secretly excited by Herké's clumsy advances on her, and she should somehow make it clear that at 16 she'd be willing to marry him so that he could divorce his wife, so that the dad could have his mistress. I'm not at all sure that would work out, even if Dora did. So Dora refuses, and her defense is to say, okay, I'm here as a patient because my dad said so, and I'm now I'm going to demand answers, and I'm going to demand them my way. And there we can see where Freud's attempts to, although not as bad as her dad, his attempts to inhabit the master discourse require him to say things like her no meant yes, and so on. And then, but then if you deify Google and assume that it has all answers, then you are in the realm of the master discourse. But finally, if you ask Google to, I think you'd have maybe a better thing would be to switch to Facebook in this analogy, because Facebook, in a sense, Google's you, and you can have Google, but Facebook Google's you. It inventories anything that you any desire that you demonstrate by all the desires you demonstrate. No, all the demands that urge you to click things in a search for your desire become a data collection site, so that the ads that are sent your way can be customized, so that we're not just customizing the product, but we're trying to customize the ad that is most likely to make you perceive the product as occupying the position of the fetish, because that's a very particular thing, and advertising has traditionally had to present itself in pretty broad strokes, like a billboard. I mean, how many people are looking at that seeking arrangement billboard? How many are actually addressed? How many are actually targeted? It's very hit or miss. What Google and Facebook, Instagram, all the clickables, they are attempting to design a specific fetish. The more specific the fetish, the more powerful it will be, the less you will be able to see the constructedness of how it can only posture as the equivalent of the lack that generates the gap between you and your ideal image. Well, I don't know. That's a lot. I don't know how long this takes us, but I'm going to stop anyway. And I will be there at 6:30 p.m. I'll send you a link. And let's get to this next phase of this insane semester, where I'll be doing one class live, whatever that is, and 2 online. Got about 1 more month. So I don't know. I hope this class has been, I've taught this class before. I used to teach it with Laura Carney a long time ago, but this time it's been a very live wire for me. And that probably translates into even more than usual questioning for you guys. But let me encourage you to hang in there, because the value of this class, frankly, is quite high, I think, if you can not treat, and this is the other problem with the university, don't treat the class as a product. I mean, this is something I suppose I'll retire at some point, because I am a little out of sync, I think, with the increasing bureaucracy of the university, the increasing sense that courses have to adjust themselves to appear to be the equivalent of the demand of the student's desire, which often is to figure out how to plug yourself into the bureaucratic workplace. So increasingly, I get documents demanding that I list the learning objectives of the class. I don't even understand that question. I don't know how I can determine your learning objectives. You're either learning or you're not. How would I know? So I'm trying not to turn into Gregor Samsa here. I'm getting bureaucratic demands all the time from the administration. And the only thing that saves me, to be honest, is the enrollment. And this is, weirdly enough, this is where your course evaluations matter, because as far as the administration is concerned, I'm a less and less useful member, but they, at the same time, they want enrollment. That's the currency of the university. So to the degree that students continue to respond to my open-ended questioning, I'm kind of untouchable, because the administration can't diminish or fire, not that I'm actually going to be fired, who generates so much enrollment. In this case, I've generated a film minor, which is now a film major. There's been 4 tenure stream hires to staff programs that my classes have begun. They can't get rid of me. I'm a cash cow for them. I don't feel that. That's not how I see myself. But it's based on, frankly, on the willingness of students to see the value of open-endedness. And not all students adore my classes. I don't want to shock you. And the ones who don't, it's pretty consistent. This is not what I had a right to expect. This is not a product. And they're right. I have no critique of my detractors. The only place I would disagree is how they assign value. They're absolutely right about what they don't, about my classes, and they claim to don't like it, to not like it, which I think is also fully their right. Where then there's a slippage where they wind up saying this isn't education. It is for me, but this is a dialogue. It can continue to be educating for me, but if it ceases to be educating for you, then I will no longer function productively for the system. Okay, I don't know if that was a vague plug for why course evaluations may matter, because the university is getting very administrative. It's getting very business oriented. It's very workplace oriented. But the one thing that they can't, because they're workplace oriented, they can't turn away from enrollment. So if you think of yourself as a nation of sorts, what you value and what you don't value is the only thing that has any serious influence on the direction the administration takes. There's in the same way that what's stopping Putin right now, I'm not going to say the U of T administration is Putin, but if we just look at the functioning here, what's stopping Putin is the refusal of the Ukrainians to see being Ukrainian as without value, without merit, and even without credence, credibility, visibility. If that goes away, then and had it not been there in the first place, then Kiev would have been taken in half a day. Anyway, let me sign off, and watch for your link, and come to tomorrow night with questions, especially if I like holding up these cards. Sometimes I realize, wait a minute, was that the one I wanted to hold up while I was saying that? So do let me know what's making sense and what isn't. But in this class, as in most of my classes, the way things make sense is they make things less clear. They they make what you thought you knew less certain. But that's partly to open up the way for you to be not so vulnerable to the market of ideas, the market of products, the market of marketing happiness to you for a price, when that happiness is really just the successful application of yourself to an untenable solution of your divided subjectivity between your body without quotes and your body with quotes. All right, that's enough. Goodbye. Enjoy the rest of your weekend or whenever you listen to this. And bye for now.